In late 1974, in a conference room in Osaka, a small delegation from Sony sat across the table from executives at Matsushita Electric and laid out a videotape recorder they called Beta. Sony had built it in secret, refined it for years, and now, rather than simply launching it alone, the company's leadership wanted something bigger. They wanted every major electronics maker in Japan to adopt Beta as the single home video standard, the way an entire industry sometimes rallies behind one format for the good of everyone involved. Sony brought a working prototype into the room. Sony explained the engineering. Sony asked Matsushita and its subsidiary, a smaller manufacturer called JVC, to sign on. Matsushita's founder, Konosuke Matsushita, was not pleased. He had not been consulted while Beta was being designed, and he was being asked, after the fact, to simply agree to build products around a standard someone else controlled from top to bottom. At a later meeting, Matsushita's people, with JVC's own management sitting beside them, showed Sony something in return, an early prototype of a rival system. They told Sony it was not too late to abandon its own format and back this one instead, for the good of the industry. Sony's engineers were too far into production to turn back, and they felt, not unreasonably, that they had shared their own work in good faith only to be shown a competing answer in the same room. Neither side backed down. The stage was set for what would become one of the most studied format wars in the history of consumer technology, and Sony was about to discover that inventing the better machine and winning the market were two entirely different problems. 50 years later, the format that came out of that Osaka meeting is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as the loser. Sony itself has moved on almost entirely from physical video formats altogether. Its modern entertainment business built instead around a video game and network services division, a film and television studio, and, through more recent acquisitions, a streaming platform aimed at a younger audience than the one that ever argued over cassette formats in an electronics shop. The company that spent 8 years in federal court defending your right to record a television broadcast onto a cassette now operates almost entirely in a world where nothing needs to be recorded at all, because everything simply streams on demand. Ask most people under 40 what Betamax actually was, and they will tell you, correctly, that it lost to something called VHS. Almost none of them can tell you why, because the honest answer is uncomfortable for a company that built its entire reputation on engineering excellence. Betamax did not lose because it was worse. By most technical measurements available at the time, it was better. It lost because Sony, the company that would go on to invent the Walkman just 4 years later and teach the entire world what portable, personal audio should feel like, made almost the exact same mistake with video that it would later repeat with minidisc, with its memory stick format, and with its own digital music strategy a quarter century after that. Sony built something better, and then tried to keep it entirely to itself. This is the story of how the company that invented the home video cassette recorder lost the format war it started, to a rival that built a worse machine and simply let more people build it. But before we go any further, I have a small favor to ask. We work incredibly hard on these investigations, pulling apart engineering archives, trade press coverage from the 1970s, litigation records, and the interviews the people involved gave decades after the fact, so that these stories get told with the actual detail they deserve. But our analytics tell us the vast majority of you watching right now are not subscribed. It takes 2 seconds, it costs you absolutely nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. So if you think a story like this one deserves to be told properly, hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you. Now let's go back to where the whole rivalry actually started. To understand why that 1974 meeting went so badly, you have to understand that Sony, Matsushita, and JVC were not strangers walking into a negotiation cold. They had already worked together once before, and that earlier collaboration is exactly what made the later betrayal, on both sides, feel so personal. In 1969, the three companies had cooperated on an earlier videotape format called U-matic, a large cassette-based system aimed at broadcasters and businesses rather than ordinary households. Sony had led that development, contributing the core cassette mechanism, while Matsushita and JVC each brought their own manufacturing expertise to the partnership, an arrangement that worked well enough commercially that U-matic decks remained standard equipment in television newsrooms for years afterward. It worked. It also proved to everyone involved that the underlying technology for cassette-based video recording, wrapping magnetic tape around a rotating head assembly inside a sealed plastic shell so an untrained person could simply load it and press play, was mature enough to eventually shrink down to something a family could afford for their living room. Once U-matic proved the concept, all three companies quietly began working on their own separate consumer version, each one trying to get there first, and each one assuming, reasonably enough given their recent history of cooperation, that whoever arrived with a working prototype would set the terms for everyone else. Matsushita began developing its own format internally, an effort that would eventually be shelved once Betamax and VHS made clear which two systems the market was actually going to choose between. JVC, the smallest of the three companies and technically a subsidiary of Matsushita at the time, was the one nobody in that Osaka meeting room expected to end up owning the entire home video industry a decade later. Sony's version of that next step was led by engineers within the company's audio and video divisions, who had spent years refining rotary head recording technology, building on lessons from Sony's earlier professional video work. Sony called the result Betamax, a name derived from the Japanese word for the shape the tape traced across the recording head, and unveiled it publicly on the 10th of May, 1975. The Betamax SL6300, the first commercial model, sold in Japan bundled with a television for a price that put it firmly in the premium tier of consumer electronics, well beyond an impulse purchase for most families. Sony marketed the device around a single, genuinely revolutionary concept. You no longer had to be sitting in front of your television at the exact moment a broadcast aired. You could record a program while you were out, and watch it whenever you actually had time. Sony called this time shifting, and for 1975, it was closer to science fiction than a consumer feature. Across town, at JVC's Yokohama plant, two engineers named Yuma Shiraishi and Shizuo Takano had been quietly pursuing their own version of the same idea since 1971. Working under a self-imposed set of design objectives they had sketched onto an internal chart the team nicknamed the VHS Development Matrix. Their list of requirements was almost aggressively practical. The machine had to work with any ordinary television set already in someone's living room. The picture quality had to be roughly comparable to a normal broadcast, not necessarily better than one. And critically, the tape had to hold at least 2 hours of continuous recording, enough for a full-length film or a complete televised sporting event without having to stop and swap a cassette partway through. Shiraishi and Takano built a working prototype by 1973, 2 years before Sony's public unveiling of Betamax, but internal budget cuts inside JVC's video division nearly killed the project entirely. The two engineers kept working on it in relative secrecy, refining the design without full official backing, convinced that what they were building mattered even when their own management was not yet sure. Neither Shiraishi nor Takano became household names the way Sony's own founders did. There is no Walkman-style museum exhibit built around either of them, no widely told founder legend. Takano died in 1992, and the New York Times ran a brief obituary noting that he had helped develop the VHS recorder, a single sentence carrying the weight of a format that had, by that point, generated tens of billions of dollars in hardware and cassette sales worldwide, and reshaped how an entire planet watched films. The engineers who built the format that won barely registered in the popular memory of the war, they decided. The ones who built Betamax, working under Sony's far more visible corporate identity, are remembered even less by name, if at all. Think about what those two competing design philosophies actually meant for the person standing in an electronics shop in 1976. Sony had built the more technically accomplished machine, genuinely sharper picture resolution, at its fastest recording speed, a more precise mechanism, the kind of engineering polish the company had built its entire reputation on since the transistor radios of the 1950s. JVC had built a machine explicitly designed around one number that consumers cared about far more than picture sharpness. How much could you actually record before you had to get up and change the tape? Betamax's original recording limit was 60 minutes. VHS launched with 2 full hours from day one. If you wanted to record a football game or tape a rented film to watch later that weekend, that single number decided the argument before anyone ever compared the picture quality side by side. JVC's HR3300, the first commercial VHS recorder, went on sale in Japan on the 9th of September 1976, roughly 16 months after Betamax had already reached the market. Sony had a genuine head start, and for a brief window in the middle of the decade, Betamax held effectively the entire home video market simply because nothing else existed to compete with it. By some industry counts, Sony had already sold around 200,000 Betamax units in Japan before JVC's rival machine even reached dealer shelves. A head start like that, in almost any other industry, would have been decisive. Before VHS even reached the market, Japan's own government tried to prevent the format war from happening at all. The Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry, a powerful body that had spent decades coordinating the country's industrial policy, grew concerned that 2 incompatible home video formats fighting for the same domestic market would confuse consumers and waste national manufacturing capacity that could be better spent competing against American and European rivals abroad. The ministry attempted to broker a single unified standard, and in one of the more remarkable footnotes of this entire story, its officials leaned toward backing Betamax specifically because Sony already had a product in place and ready to ship, while JVC's rival system was still unproven. Matsushita and JVC declined to fall in line. They had already built their own format, believed in the 2-hour recording advantage they had designed around from the very beginning, and were not willing to abandon years of engineering work on the say-so of a ministry, however powerful. It is a genuinely striking detail that even the Japanese government initially bet on the format that would go on to lose. Betamax did not fail for lack of institutional backing. It failed despite having it. It was not decisive here, and the reason comes down to a single strategic decision each company made in the years immediately following that tense 1974 meeting, a decision about who, exactly, would be allowed to build machines compatible with each format. JVC made its format essentially available to anyone. The company licensed VHS aggressively and cheaply to other manufacturers, and within a remarkably short window, some of the largest electronics brands in the world were building their own VHS hardware alongside JVC's own machines. RCA, the dominant American television and electronics brand of the era, signed on and began selling VHS recorders under its own name in the United States, starting in 1977. Matsushita, the same company whose founder had felt spurned by Sony 3 years earlier, backed VHS through its own Panasonic and Quasar brands. Sharp, Magnavox, Zenith, and a growing list of manufacturers across Japan, the United States, and Europe all followed. Every one of those companies, once they signed on, became in effect an extension of JVC's own sales force, each one competing to sell VHS hardware at lower and lower prices as manufacturing scale increased, and each one adding to a rapidly growing catalog of machines that all played the exact same cassettes. Sony did the opposite. In the years immediately following the failed 1974 negotiation, Sony kept the circle of Betamax licensees deliberately narrow, retaining tight control over who could manufacture compatible hardware and on what terms. A handful of companies, including Toshiba and Sanyo, did sign on to build beta format machines, and Sony continued refining the format itself, eventually introducing a second-generation Betamax that extended the original 60-minute recording limit out to 2 hours to match VHS directly. But the core commercial instinct never changed. Sony believed, and continued to act on the belief for years after the evidence had started pointing the other way, that owning the format tightly and controlling the quality of every machine that carried the Betamax name mattered more than maximizing the number of companies building and selling that hardware. That single difference in licensing philosophy is the entire war, and everything that followed was really just the market working out the mathematics of that decision over the following decade. Every additional manufacturer building VHS hardware meant another company competing on price, which meant VHS machines got cheaper faster than Betamax machines did, because Sony's tighter control meant fewer competing factories driving costs down. Every additional VHS manufacturer also meant another company with a sales relationship to electronics retailers, another catalog listing, another set of shelf space negotiations working in the format's favor. And there was a second, less obvious consequence that turned out to matter just as much. The video rental industry, an entirely new category of small business that exploded across America and Europe in the late 1970s and early 1980s, needed to decide which format to stock, and stocking both meant doubling their inventory costs for every single title. Rental shop owners, operating on thin margins, increasingly looked at which format had more machines already sitting in more homes and stocked accordingly. It became a self-reinforcing cycle. More households with VHS machines meant rental shops stocked more VHS tapes, which made VHS machines more valuable to own, which pushed more households toward VHS, which pushed more rental shops further away from carrying beta titles at all. There was one additional market that historians of this format war return to again and again, an uncomfortable but genuinely significant factor in how quickly VHS pulled ahead. The adult film industry, then a fast-growing and cash-rich segment of home video demand, needed a format that was cheap to license and easy to duplicate at volume, and found Sony's tighter licensing terms for Betamax considerably less accommodating than JVC's open approach to VHS. Whatever a person's view of that particular market, the business reality was straightforward. An entire category of paying customers gravitated toward the format that was easier and cheaper to produce content for, and every one of those transactions reinforced VHS's growing lead in exactly the same way rental shop stocking decisions did. Stand in an American electronics store in 1980 for a moment and look at what is actually on the shelf. Walk into an American video rental shop on a Friday evening in 1982 and watch what actually happens at the counter. A father is holding two cassettes, a new release he wants, and a children's film for the kids waiting by the door, and before he even looks at the titles printed on the spine, he glances down at the format markings, because he owns one machine at home, not two, and if the shop's copy of tonight's film is beta and his machine is VHS, or the other way around, the whole errand was pointless. Behind the counter, the shop's own inventory decisions are being made on exactly the same logic, multiplied by every customer who walks through that door in a week. Stocking a title in both formats doubles the shelf space and the upfront cost for a small business already operating on thin margins, and by 1982, in most American towns, that calculation was no longer close. The shop stocks VHS. It stocks VHS because the shop down the street stocks VHS, and the shop down the street stocks VHS because more of its customers already own VHS machines at home, and around that loop turns, tightening a little further with every Friday night rental. Beta machines sit in one section, still respected, still marketed on picture quality, still carrying something of a premium reputation among people who had bought early and cared about technical performance. VHS machines dominate everything around them. More brands, more price points, a wall of options from budget models to feature-laden top-of-the-line units, and beside the hardware, an entire wall of rental cassettes stretching floor to ceiling, the overwhelming majority of them VHS. By 1980, VHS held roughly 60% of the North American home video market. A year later, Beta's share had fallen to around 25%. Sony had been first to market by more than a year. It did not matter. Sony's own marketing compounded the problem rather than solving it. The company continued emphasizing picture quality and the original time-shifting concept, the ability to record whatever was on television right now as its central sales pitch, a genuinely accurate claim, but one that VHS machines could make with equal honesty while also offering twice the recording time. Sony was, in effect, running an advertising campaign built around a feature both formats shared, while quietly losing the argument on the one feature that actually decided most people's purchase. By 1987, VHS commanded somewhere around 90% of the entire United States home video market. Betamax, the format that had arrived first, that had genuinely superior picture resolution at its fastest recording speed, that Sony had spent years refining and defending, had been reduced to a shrinking niche, still beloved by a dwindling group of enthusiasts who valued the technical edge, increasingly abandoned by everyone else. Sony did not go quietly, and it is worth giving the company credit for how hard its engineers kept fighting a war the business side had, by any honest reading of the sales figures, already lost. In 1983, Sony introduced Beta Hi-Fi, adding genuinely excellent audio quality to the format years before VHS machines could match it, a real technical achievement that briefly gave Betamax owners something to point to that their VHS-owning neighbors simply could not have. In 1985, with the format's market share already in serious decline, Sony released ED Beta, an extended definition version promising a sharper picture than anything VHS had ever offered. Audio-visual magazines of the era tested it and largely agreed the picture quality claim was genuine. None of it mattered. By 1985, the rental shop shelves, the manufacturer count, and the sheer number of VHS machines already sitting in American living rooms had built a lead no single technical improvement could close. Sony kept building a better machine for an audience that had already, in overwhelming numbers, decided the argument was over. The consumer video rental chain that would come to symbolize VHS's total victory did not exist when the format war began. Blockbuster, founded in Texas in 1985, built its entire national retail model around a format that had, by the time the company opened its doors, already won. Blockbuster never seriously stocked Betamax titles at meaningful scale, because by 1985 there was, commercially, no reason to. The chain that would eventually grow into thousands of stores across the world and become one of the defining retail brands of the 1990s was, in a very real sense, built on the exact network effect that had crushed Sony's format 5 years earlier. More VHS machines in homes, more VHS tapes worth stocking, more VHS stores worth opening. In 1988, Sony did something that would have been almost unthinkable to the executives who walked out of that 1974 meeting convinced they held the stronger hand. The company that had built the entire format, that had spent more than a decade defending Betamax against a rival it considered technically inferior, began manufacturing and selling its own VHS machines. It was, in every meaningful sense, a surrender, quiet, unannounced with any particular fanfare, but total. The company that invented the home videocassette recorder had conceded the format war to a company that, 13 years earlier, had been the smaller subsidiary partner in the very meeting where the fight began. You can read what happened in that 1974 meeting two ways, and honest history holds both readings at once. One reading says Sony's instinct to protect the format it had invented was entirely rational. Sony had put genuine engineering investment into Betamax, had built manufacturing capacity around it, and had every right to want to control the quality and consistency of hardware carrying its name into people's living rooms, rather than watching cheaper, lower-quality knockoffs erode consumer trust in the format. The other reading says Sony fundamentally misunderstood what actually wins a consumer technology war. It is not the machine with the best specification sheet. It is the machine with the most manufacturers building it, the most retailers stocking it, and the most rental shelves carrying content for it. because those three things compound on each other in a way no single company, however skilled its engineers, can outbuild alone. Both readings have real evidence behind them. The consequence, whichever reading you find more persuasive, was the same. Sony had the better machine. JVC had the better business. Sony's own record on Betamax after the surrender tells its own quiet story about what actually got lost. The company did not abandon the format overnight. Betamax hardware remained in production in Japan for years after Sony began selling VHS decks alongside it, serving a shrinking but genuinely loyal base of owners who had invested in the format and were not ready to let it go. Sony finally stopped manufacturing Betamax recorders in 2002, 27 years after the original launch, and continued producing blank Betamax cassettes for existing machines even longer than that, only discontinuing the tape itself in 2016, more than 4 decades after that first tense meeting in Osaka. There is another battle Sony was fighting during these same years, one that had nothing to do with JVC or market share at all, and it very nearly ended the entire home video industry before either format could win anything. In 1976, the same year JVC's first VHS recorder reached Japanese shelves, Universal City Studios and Walt Disney Productions sued Sony directly in United States federal court, arguing that Betamax itself was an instrument of mass copyright infringement, because it let ordinary people record copyrighted television broadcasts without permission. The studios were not suing over piracy or bootlegging in the sense we would recognize it today. They were suing over the basic act of recording a television program to watch later, the exact feature Sony had built its entire original marketing pitch around. The case, formally titled Sony Corporation of America versus Universal City Studios, ground through the American court system for the better part of 8 years. A federal district court initially ruled in Sony's favor in 1979, finding that recording a broadcast for personal, non-commercial viewing later was a legitimate fair use of copyrighted material. Universal and Disney appealed, and in 1981, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that ruling entirely, holding that Sony could be held liable for what its own legal team called contributory copyright infringement, essentially arguing that Sony was responsible for how customers used a machine it manufactured and sold. Had that appeals court ruling stood, Sony would have faced potentially ruinous damages, and the entire consumer video recorder industry, VHS manufacturers very much included, would have been built on legally uncertain ground from that point forward. Sony took the case to the Supreme Court of the United States, and on the 17th of January 1984, the justices ruled in Sony's favor by a margin of 5 votes to 4, one of the closest and most consequential decisions in the history of American copyright law. The court held that recording a broadcast for private, non-commercial time shifting was fair use, and that a manufacturer could not be held liable for contributory infringement simply because its product was capable of being used to copy something, so long as the device also had substantial legitimate, non-infringing uses. Legal scholars still refer to the case simply as the Betamax case, and its reasoning went on to shield an entire generation of later technologies from similar lawsuits, including personal computers, photocopiers, and, in a detail that carries its own quiet irony given everything that happened afterward, the very digital music players that would eventually help end Sony's dominance in portable audio. Sit with the timing of that ruling for a moment. Sony spent 8 years and a Supreme Court case successfully defending the public's legal right to use the Betamax exactly as designed. At the same moment, its own licensing strategy was quietly ensuring that fewer and fewer members of that same public would ever own one. The company won the single most important legal battle in the format's entire history, and lost the format anyway, a detail that belongs at the center of any honest account of what actually happened here, rather than at its margins. The rotary head recording technology underneath Betamax did not simply disappear once the consumer format lost. In 1982, Sony adapted the same core engineering into a professional broadcast format called Betacam, built for television news cameras and studio production rather than living rooms. Betacam, and its later digital descendants, went on to become the dominant professional video format inside television newsrooms and production houses worldwide for the better part of 3 decades, used to shoot an enormous share of the news footage, documentaries, and television programming an entire planet watched from the early 1980s, well into the 2000s. Sony lost the living room. It quietly won the newsroom, using the exact same underlying invention sold through a business model: tight licensing, premium pricing, specialized professional customers who valued technical performance over raw price, that happened to be perfectly suited to broadcasters in a way it had never been suited to families deciding which format to rent movies on. The engineering that lost the consumer format war became almost unnoticed by the public that had abandoned Betamax, one of the most commercially successful and long-lived professional video formats in the history of television. There is a pattern here worth sitting with, because it did not stay contained to videotape. The same instinct that led Sony to keep Betamax licensing tight rather than open would resurface, almost unchanged, in decision after decision across the following 3 decades. When Sony built Minidisc in 1992, hoping it would eventually replace the cassette the way Betamax had originally hoped to define home video, the company again kept the recording format, the compression codec, and the licensing terms entirely inside its own walls, and Minidisc, while it built a genuinely devoted following, particularly in Japan, never came close to the mass adoption Sony had hoped for. When digital music arrived at the end of the 1990s, Sony again reached first for a proprietary, tightly controlled format of its own, called A-Track, rather than embracing the open MP3 standard millions of listeners had already adopted, and watched a company with no video format history at all, no record label to protect, and no institutional memory of the 1974 meeting, build the definitive digital music player of the era instead. Betamax was not a one-time mistake. It was the first and clearest expression of an instinct that would keep costing Sony market after market for the following 30 years. The belief that owning a format completely was worth more than winning the largest possible number of people who actually used it. It is worth stating plainly what Sony actually lost in dollar terms, to the extent the historical record allows. VHS format licensing and hardware sales generated tens of billions of dollars in cumulative global revenue across the format's 3-decade dominance, spread across dozens of manufacturers rather than concentrated in a single company's accounts. Had Betamax achieved anything close to that same market position under Sony's original, far more restrictive licensing terms, the majority of that revenue would have flowed through a single corporate structure rather than being shared among competitors. Sony did not simply lose a format war. It handed an entire multi-decade industry, one it had built the founding technology for, to a rival that then went on to use the profits from that dominance to fund its own semiconductor and consumer electronics ambitions for years afterward. The secondary market for surviving Betamax hardware tells a small, quiet coda to the whole story. Working beta decks, particularly the higher-end models Sony released in the format's later years, once it had matched VHS on recording time, now sell to a genuine community of collectors and format enthusiasts, some of whom maintain that Betamax's picture quality, at its best recording speed, still holds up better than most VHS hardware of the same era ever did. That community keeps the format alive today with almost no support from Sony itself, sourcing replacement belts and rubber rollers through the same kind of specialist parts networks that keep vintage cassette decks and turntables running decades after the companies that built them stopped caring. The people who still believe Betamax was the better machine are, in a strange way, the last people continuing an argument Sony itself gave up making in 1988. There is a counterfactual worth asking honestly, the same kind of question that haunts almost every story in this archive. What would have happened if Sony had licensed Betamax as openly and as cheaply as JVC licensed VHS from the very beginning, rather than keeping the format tightly controlled through the years that decided the war? The honest answer is that Sony's technical advantage was real and, on the evidence of Beta Hi-Fi and ED Beta in the format's final years once both systems matched on recording time, arguably durable. An openly licensed Betamax, with the same manufacturing scale and rental shop penetration VHS eventually achieved, might well have become the format history remembers as the winner rather than the cautionary tale. Some industry historians go further still, arguing that had the Ministry of International Trade and Industry succeeded in its original attempt to force a single national standard around Betamax in 1975, before JVC's rival system had even reached the market, the entire format war might never have happened at all, and Sony's tighter control would never have mattered because there would have been no competing format left to out-license. What is equally true is that Sony's entire corporate identity, going back to its earliest transistor radios, had been built on the idea that owning your own engineering completely was the source of the company's advantage. And asking that same company to hand its newest invention to rivals it had only recently competed against in the professional video market was, from inside Sony's boardroom in 1974, a genuinely difficult ask, rather than an obvious one. The tragedy is not that Sony's instinct to protect its own engineering was irrational. It is that the company never learned, even after losing this exact argument once, that the instinct itself was the actual cost. Somewhere tonight, in a garage in Osaka, or a collector's workshop in Ohio, or a vintage electronics stall in London, a Betamax deck from the late 1970s is switched on. A black cassette slides into the loading mechanism. The tape threads across the spinning head assembly, the way Sony's engineers designed it to nearly half a century ago, and a picture that still, by the honest testimony of the people who kept these machines running, holds a genuine technical edge over most surviving VHS hardware of the same vintage flickers onto a screen. The corporation that built that machine is still very much alive, one of the largest media and entertainment companies on Earth, richer and larger by almost every measure than it was in 1975. But the specific argument that machine was built to win, that the better engineered format deserves to become the standard everyone uses, is not the argument history actually settled. The deck does not know that. It only knows how to record, and how to play back exactly what was recorded, the same as it always has. If you ever owned a Betamax, worked at a video rental shop during the format war, or picked a side back when the choice actually mattered, drop a comment below. Tell us which format your family owned, the year, and whether you still have the machine. The people who actually lived through that choice at the counter of an electronics shop understand what decided it far better than any case study written afterward. Subscribe to Silicon Archives if you want the rest of these stories, because there are a lot of them left, and this exact pattern, the better machine built by a company too protective of its own invention to let it win, is one this channel is going to keep finding, again and again, in places you would not expect.